Okay, so this week you guys sent in some really cool stuff. And it's all kind of centered on, I guess you could say, a huge moment in a pilot's journey,
Yeah,
the first solo flight.
right.
And, it struck me as I was going through this that this is one of those experiences that no matter where it happens in your training, whether you're a, you know, 16-year-old kid doing it or you're someone who's, decided to learn to fly later in life,
Yeah.
it seems like it's something that just stays with you.
Oh, yeah, for sure. One of the sources you sent over even described it as, a memory second to none.
Mm.
And that's a sentiment that really resonates. That feeling of being airborne and
Mm.
truly the pilot in command for the first time with that instructor's seat empty next to you is, uh, it's a feeling like no other.
Mm.
And it brings with it, I think, a really profound sense of both accomplishment and responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And the article even had that little aside, like, go ahead and check again. It's unoccupied,
Yeah.
which I thought was so funny because, you can just imagine that, like, almost that surreal feeling of, like, wait a minute, I'm up here by myself right now. So for this deep dive, we're going to unpack, why this first solo is such a significant event, what actually goes into it, like how a student pilot knows they're ready, and even some of the, like, practical, considerations involved, all based on this really great material you sent.
So to kick things off, I think it's fair to say that, yeah, soloing's a big deal.
Definitely.
The article calls it exactly that, a big deal, and a tangible training milestone. It's
Oh,
not just, another lesson checked off in your syllabus. It's a real line in the sand in your development as a pilot.
and it seems like such a confidence builder too, right?
Yeah.
Like I was reading through the source material and, they really emphasized it as a key confidence builder for the student. And it just makes sense, right? All of a sudden, it's not just reacting to instructions. It's like
Yeah.
you are making the decisions, you're executing the maneuvers.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that boost in confidence tends to then fuel their learning in subsequent and more challenging phases of training.
Hmm.
The article even pointed out that solo authorization really marks the start of that transition towards focusing on the specific solo flight requirements outlined in your training program and really, starting to make those command decisions independently without the immediate guidance of your instructor.
Which makes perfect sense. I mean, it's not like they just hand out a solo endorsement just because. Like,
Yeah.
the source material notes that it signifies you've actually satisfied some very specific regulatory requirements, both in terms of your knowledge, the theoretical knowledge and the practical flight training.
Yeah.
And on top of that, your instructor has to actually provide like a written certification of your competence within some defined limitations.
Yeah, that written sign-off from your instructor is really key because it's not just based on, your feeling of preparedness.
Right.
There are objective standards that have to be met and documented. And anyone listening who really wants to dig into the nitty-gritty details, the article directs us to Federal Aviation Regulation 61.87,
Hmm.
which basically spells out what your instructor needs to assess you on, both from an understanding of, aviation rules, as well as your ability to safely control the aircraft before they can sign off on that first solo flight.
So listeners, if you're a student pilot out there, FAR 61.87, definitely worth getting familiar with.
Absolutely.
The article also mentions this pre-solo written test.
Right.
That sounds like one of those initial hurdles, right?
It is. And it's not just about taking the test itself. The regulation actually, as the article highlights, mandates that your instructor has to administer this written exam and, importantly, review any incorrect answers with you.
Oh.
They need to make sure you understand those concepts before they'll grant that solo authorization.
It's not just memorizing. It's like you got to know it.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly.
So, okay, I think the question that's on every student pilot's mind is how does a student actually know when they are getting close to that ready to solo moment?
Right. Well, the article addresses this well and basically emphasizes that your instructor should be giving you feedback on your progress constantly throughout your training. And as you get closer to soloing, you're likely going to start noticing a shift in how your training flights are actually conducted.
Mm.
Your instructor is going to slowly transition from, actively teaching and demonstrating to more of an evaluative role, just observing how you're handling different scenarios and maneuvers on your own.
And I think what's really cool and helpful is that there's a part of the article that actually addresses that nervousness that a lot of students feel. It even says, like, don't be surprised if the instructor pronounces you ready to solo while you're still, feeling some hesitancy,
Yeah.
which I'm sure is super common.
Oh, I'm sure it is. I mean, it's a big step.
Yeah.
But the article follows that up with something really reassuring. It basically says, trust your instructor's judgment and have faith in your own abilities. They've been guiding you. They've seen you develop firsthand, and they have a professional responsibility to make sure you're actually ready.
Yeah.
So their assessment carries a lot of weight.
That's so true. But it's not just, your individual skill and confidence, right?
Right.
The article even talks about how, having just the right conditions is super important for that first solo flight.
Definitely. Weather needs to be favorable. The airport traffic should be light and manageable. It's not something they'll just send you up for on any given day, regardless of what's going on around you.
Yeah.
And the article even mentions the importance of patience. If the conditions aren't quite right, it's always better to wait to continue practicing and refining your skills until everything lines up perfectly.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's actually talk about that first solo flight itself.
Right.
The article brings up some really practical operational considerations, and one of the first things it mentions is limitations on wind.
Yeah, and this is all about safety, especially during those initial solo flights when you're still building up your experience and confidence flying on your own. The article states that those first solos will typically happen on days with light winds and excellent visibility. And your instructor is going to set some specific safe operating limits for you, and that'll probably include like minimums for your cloud ceiling and visibility, and maximums for total wind speed, and importantly, that crosswind component.
Now, crosswind component might be a term that some listeners aren't, totally familiar with.
Right.
Just maybe break that down a bit.
Yeah, so crosswind is basically wind that's blowing from the side relative to the direction of the runway.
Okay.
And the component part of that refers to how much of that total wind is acting perpendicularly across the runway.
Okay.
So instructors will set limits on, how strong that sideways wind can be for your first solo, because, a strong crosswind demands more precise control inputs during takeoff and especially during landing.
Gotcha. Thanks for clarifying that. Now, there was a piece of advice in the article about landing that I thought was super interesting. It said, if you don't like how a landing approach is developing, the answer is to go around.
Right.
And it really drove home the point that landing is only an option.
Absolutely. That's such a fundamental principle of flight safety, and I love the way they put it.
You too.
Landing is only an option because it takes away any pressure to try and force a landing if things aren't feeling right.
Exactly.
And the article even notes that your instructor will likely be happy with you making that decision, to execute a go-around.
Right.
Because it shows good judgment and a commitment to flying safely above all else.
So, okay, you've had this, incredible experience of this first solo flight. How does that actually get recorded in your logbook?
Right. So the article's very clear that any flight time you accumulate while you are the sole occupant of the aircraft and you've got the appropriate solo endorsement from your instructor is logged as pilot in command time, or PIC. And it even points to AR 61.51E4, which, specifically outlines the conditions under which a student pilot can log PIC time. These include things like, being the only person in the aircraft, having that specific solo flight endorsement in your logbook from your instructor, and, actively undergoing training for a pilot certificate or rating.
So it's official you're the PIC during those authorized solo flights.
You got it.
The article even smartly advises listeners to make sure that you are logging all applicable solo flight time as PIC because, every hour counts towards your overall experience requirements for future pilot certifications. So now this next point from the article was something that I found pretty interesting because it kind of poses this seemingly random question, what should I wear?
Yeah, that might seem a little out of place, but it actually ties into a bit of aviation tradition that surrounds the first solo.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The article recommends wearing comfortable clothes and footwear, which is good advice for any flight. But then it specifically says on your first solo, don't wear a shirt you plan to wear again. Right. It's a little intriguing. Well, it turns out there's this long-standing aviation custom called the shirt tail tradition that a lot of student pilots experience after that successful first solo.
Okay.
And it suggests that if you're not already familiar with this tradition, you should ask your flight instructor about it before your first solo. That way, you understand why they're telling you not to wear your favorite shirt.
So there's a story there.
Sounds like there is a story, and maybe even a pair of scissors involved.
Oh, I love a good tradition, and especially one with a little mystery.
Right.
So listeners, if you are about to embark on that first solo, make sure to ask your instructor about the shirt tail tradition. Sounds like a pretty memorable part of the whole experience.
Oh, yeah. It's one of those unique cultural elements within aviation that really adds to the significance of the first solo.
For sure. So to kind of bring this all together, this deep dive into the material you provided really highlights how important that first solo flight is. It's a major training milestone, a huge confidence booster, and it really stands as a testament to, the student pilot's hard work, dedication, and, developing skills.
Yeah, we covered the regulatory requirements, the crucial role of your instructor in assessing your readiness, the importance of sticking to those safe operating limits, the proper way to log that solo flight time, and even that fun little aviation tradition.
And it really hits home that level of trust and demonstrated competence that an instructor sees in a student pilot when they finally say, okay, I think you're ready to go up on your own.
Yeah, it's really
I think
something.
it's a huge moment.
It is.
Okay.
And, it brings up a thought for you, our listener. Think about the moments in your own life where you've taken that first independent step in a new, challenging endeavor.
Ooh, that's good.
What did it take to get there? How much preparation, trust, and, a leap of faith were involved? Maybe reflecting on those experiences can give you a new appreciation for how big of a deal that first solo flight really is.
Yeah, that is a great point.